Why do you play video games? It's a pretty simple question, right? And for most of us, I bet the main reason is that simple two-word answer: for fun. And I'm right there with you. When I kick my feet up at the end of the day and settle in front of my TV, I typically want to disconnect with the help of unadulterated escapism. But as fun as it could be to veg out to something like Tetris Effect, Astrobot, or other low-stakes experiences that you can tune out and tune into, it should come as no surprise to anyone who is familiar with this channel that while I can definitely play games just for fun, I am usually far more invested in narratives than pure recreation. And more often than not, I am more invested in stories that are tonally heavy. And sometimes, I like to explore things that push it a little further. Nature versus nurture, chemical imbalances versus situational sadness, mental illness versus raw pessimism. I am one of those. I have been dealing with depression longer than I care to admit. And as anyone with chronic depression can tell you, one of the worst parts about dealing with it is just the simple way that it can pop up out of nowhere and wreck your day. And in some cases how it could stick around in a low-grade form that leaves you in an unmotivated and downer state for weeks, months, or even years on end in some extreme cases. I am currently dealing with a low-grade depression that has been sticking around for the last few months. And before you get to worrying about me, I'm okay. I know the terrain, I have my coping mechanisms, and I know how to navigate it. But I have been procrastinating on things that I shouldn't. I've been engaging in self-soothing behaviors more often than I should, and I carry an extra load on my shoulders every day that results in a slight detachment and consistent low-grade state of brain fog. But I'm going to get through it. Typically, when I find myself in these situations, I get to exercising, I lean into my support systems, and I play games that I can truly unwind with. In my case, I usually dive headfirst into JRPGs and let myself get fully immersed into save the world narratives buffered by strategic character building and the intoxicating effects of RNG. But for some reason, this time around, I've decided to look into some games about depression and trauma as a sort of bizarre exposure therapy. And while it hasn't necessarily fixed anything, it has offered up a decent amount of perspective and has led to me playing quite a few games that I now consider to be extremely profound. I should say that I don't think this is the best approach for everyone, and the games in this video will cover all sorts of topics that can be triggering to those that are already in a compromised state. So if you aren't in the mood for doom and gloom, I would probably skip this one, or come back when you are feeling more up to it. But with that being said,
we're here to make you think about death and get sad and stuff!
like most problems we carry with us for the rest of our lives, a lot of it starts back from childhood. Before we are able to fully understand the world, the blueprint is set in front of us, and things like abuse, neglect, and substance abuse can lay the foundation on how we interface with everything going forward. Sadly for our main character, Misfortune Ramirez Hernandez, yes, she is our little misfortune, all of these problems have become normalized. We experience this modern take on the point-and-click adventure from the perspective of a goofy and imaginative 8-year-old girl. But the setup to this game gets even more tragic when it is revealed to us by a narrator that Misfortune refers to as Mr. Voice that this particular day, the day on which this game takes place, this is the day that little Misfortune will die.
This is Misfortune. She's a wonderful child from a not so wonderful family.
A little sparkle for you, and a little sparkle for you, and a little bit for me.
Oh, the sad part is, today is the day she will die.
But to keep our main character pushing forward towards her end, Mr. Voice promises that Misfortune will be granted eternal happiness if she completes his game, with Miss Hernandez agreeing to play if she can give the eternal happiness to her mother once she has won.
If you can reach the end of the game, I'll give you eternal happiness. Deal?
Eternal happiness? I guess I could give that to my mommy. Okay, it's a deal.
And just in the opening moments of this game, we see the telltale signs of neglect and even abuse, with Misfortune repeating what her mother once told her.
Mommy said she married Daddy because she was expecting me. She wanted to have an abortion, but it's illegal and against the law.
We see extreme signs of abuse by the father.
I choose the stone Daddy threw at me once.
And we are shown evidence of drugs and alcohol being in the house. Lucky for Misfortune and the player alike, once she leaves the house, things start to take on more wacky, strange, and downright surreal tones. And between the cutesy art style, Courage the Cowardly Dog style writing, and carefree performance of Misfortune's voice actress Natalia Martinson, this game manages to ride that fine line between creepy and cute. You know what I'm talking about. Salad Fingers, Invader Zim, that whole Hot Topic aesthetic that was huge with the RAR XD generation.
Yay! Happiness to the soup!
And as a fun bit of trivia, Natalia helped work on this game as co-writer, main artist, and as voice actress alongside her husband Isaac Martinson, who also wrote, programmed, and voiced Mr. Voice.
Mr. Voice, everything I touch breaks. What's wrong with me?
There's nothing wrong with you. Sometimes life is just unfair.
With the married couple being the founders and driving force behind Kill Monday Games, the Swedish studio behind Little Misfortune. And really, that mix of the two conflicting aesthetics, the creepy and the cute, that allows this game to be both incredibly sad and depressing, as we know that things can only continue to get worse for Misfortune, but it also stops things from feeling like a downright tragedy. And for this story, and especially how it ends, I think this constant gallows humor and absurdist levity stops the game from feeling like it is entirely mean-spirited. The writing is always one foot in the dark and dreary, but just before you can get too bummed out, here are some drug-addicted hamsters. As far as adventure games go, this is definitely more in line with the more modern walking simulator style. You walk forward, you progress in the story, interact with objects, and make choices that always end up punishing Misfortune as we get closer and closer to her death. And it is this cartoony aesthetic that allows for Misfortune to get bullied over and over again. Realistically, this is one of those games that I was immediately drawn to solely because of its art style. And while this is hardly entirely novel, the whole playable cartoon thing, it will always catch my attention. And if you're watching this and find yourself captured by the art style, I suggest you check it out if you can find it on the cheap. But for me, the player this time around, this one didn't hit in the way that I think it was supposed to. As far as childhood trauma is represented, I found myself incredibly locked in, especially with how our main character would constantly retreat into fantasy and escapism in order to cope. And really, that shit hit hard for me. Imaginary friends, scrapbooking, and other creative pursuits. While it all wasn't one-to-one, the amount of time that I spent reading, poring over video games, and writing myself into a better reality while my mom fought with whichever piece of shit she was dating, while I was working my way through adolescence, I definitely could see a lot of myself and that desire to protect my own innocence in Misfortune's character. But a lot of the scenarios here in this game, I couldn't help but feel that they were just constantly pulling away from the more relatable moments. And in some particular moments, it felt like the writers were wanting me to laugh at things that were just, man, I don't know. It's definitely a cool enough project, and considering how you can see just about everything that there is in a few hours, it's something that I was happy enough to play through, but I was also finding myself ready for it to be over long before the credits rolled. But I will admit, that ending, it hit hard. Kill Monday is definitely on my radar after playing this game, and even though I haven't played it, apparently this title shares some ties with the universe found in the studio's previous release, Fran Bow. So I'll definitely circle back to check that one out. But on the depression scale, I'd give this one a pretty sad, but overall it falls into that happy tree friends territory and feels more like adolescent edge or emo antics than full-on sadness. Little Misfortune and 1000 Times Resist are both games that were introduced to me by one of my friends, Chris. And yeah, that's Concord Chris if you've watched my previous upload.
Me and my crew.
But if I walked away from Little Misfortune mostly thinking, well, that was kinda cute, but not really my vibe, I could not have possibly prepared myself for 1000 Times Resist. When I told Concord Chris I was covering games about depression and trauma, he recommended Sunset Visitor's release from last year. And I'll just say it now, this is my personal game of the year for 2024. Created by a 4-person team living in the Asian diaspora of Canada, creative director Remy Sue stated in a Reddit AMA that this title was influenced by both point-and-click adventure games and JRPGs. But when it came to the specifics of this title, influences such as movies like Millennium Actress by Satoshi Kon, and In the Mood for Love by Wong Kar-wai, and even games like Nier Automata and 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim and Signalis all played a part in what this game ultimately became. And if you are someone someone like me, those influences will immediately catch your attention. 1000 Times Resist is a big game, both in size and scope. It took me close to 15 hours to see credits, and the game touts over 15,000 lines of fully voiced dialogue. Any attempt at giving a brief synopsis of this plot and its themes is going to be a battle in and of itself. But for the sake of this video and how it relates to the themes of depression and trauma, this game's particular flavor of the fucked up lies in multiple places, but nowhere as uncomfortably as the realm of intergenerational trauma. Taking place in the not-so-distant future, the principal character in 1000 Times Resist, which I'm going to refer to for the rest of this section as simply Resist, our most important character is a young woman named Iris. Iris is the daughter of Clara Kwan and a father simply referred to as Da.
Pizza? But I made your favorite, gonsu-yiming.
Ah, we do that every year.
Of course. Longevity noodle on your birthday is our tradition.
But
You're telling me you don't want a long life?
The Kwans were forced to flee Hong Kong after real-life protests launched against their police force in mainland China in 2019, which lasted until the 2020 coronavirus lockdown. They took up residence in Canada, where Iris was born, and while her parents were haunted by the brutality that they faced at the hands of the Hong Kong police force and the indignity of being chased from their home, Iris grew up as a Canadian. That is until she and the rest of the class of 2047 were having their graduation dance amid a strange disease that was rapidly cutting through the population, a disease where people were more or less crying themselves to death with symptoms not too dissimilar from chronic wasting disease. And as luck would have it, an alien invasion tied to the disease was underway until Iris happened to come in contact with one of the life forms and was granted a few gifts, with none being more important than immunity from the occupant pandemic. Jumping ahead, Iris, with the help of an organization simply known as the 50, was tested upon until clones of the one person with immunity were created. And it is here where the plot that we actually play through begins. We play as Watcher, one of the 6 senior clones known as the Sisters. Over 1,000 years have passed, and all remaining humans are clones of the All-Mother. Iris has become a god, and civilization has been chased to a corner of the earth in a facility known simply as the Orchard. Each sister serves a function, whether it be fixer, healer, militant, or in this case, bang bang fire, librarian or knower, principal, and finally Watcher. Playing as Watcher, it is our duty to fully see and understand everything there is to know about the remaining world, and most importantly, the All-Mother. And it is with this conceit that Watcher must commune with the other sisters, or meet with them in order to dive into their genetically encoded memories and learn everything that there is to know about their creator. As far as actually playing the game is concerned, this is definitely influenced by point-and-click games, but it is more in the modern standard as seen in this game's influence of 13 Sentinels Aegis Rim. And if you haven't heard of that one before, I've covered it previously in this video. Just like Little Misfortune, this is a game of walking and talking in order to advance the plot. But this story, written by Pinky Lee and Connor Wiley, is razor sharp. For a plot that slowly reveals itself to the point where it feels impenetrable and convoluted at first, once this game gets going, it never lets up. From the main plot to every optional bit of NPC dialogue, everything here builds upon this game's expanded mythology in such a way that it could make even Yoko Taro himself blush. Whether we are learning about the pressures that Iris was under before the pandemic hit,
sleepwalking again.
Well, it's that time of year.
Is she sick?
She'll be alright.
How come we can't talk about it?
When we sometimes there's things that don't need to be said.
more or less being the one person that was keeping her parents held together, or exploring the ways that she acted out as she was forced to deal with her mother's constant lashing or her father's aloofness and toxic positivity. Everything here feels so uncomfortably real, and every time the game leans into its sci-fi setting and events, we are talking about some absolute world-class stuff. Honestly, I've never been more afraid of spoiling a game in any way as I am here, so I'll just say this. I jumped into this title after hearing that it was sad and thought it might fit within this video, and that's basically all I had to go off on. And I'll be damned if it didn't end up being one of the most impactful pieces of storytelling that I've ever witnessed. So I'm going to keep this vague, and who knows, one day I might do an honest deep dive on this game, but we will see. Even though this is a walking and talking kind of experience, Resist does this expertly, but Sunset Visitor also made sure to enhance the gameplay through some fairly interesting means. With Watcher's ultimate goal of understanding Iris, diving into her memories is done through the means of two unique mechanics. First, there's time shifting. As you dive deeper and deeper into her memories, you will sometimes have the choice of jumping both forward and backward through time. These frozen moments operate as vignettes, but they take up some sort of physical space and are layered on top of one another. While traveling through one layer or time period, you may encounter a locked door or a barricade, but traveling to a layer before or after the barricade was placed will allow for you to find yourself back in that origin point just past the barricade. And when the dives get more and more spread out, a bizarre sort of Gravity Rush inspired platforming sequence will always break up the walking and talking, all while insanely metaphorical landscapes are twisted in front of you. And it is here where themes such as the abuse of power, the sins of both mother and father, learning about oneself, sacrifice, death, and most importantly, resistance are best defined. In 1,000 Times Resist, God is an abusive parent worse than any that has come before. Systems are designed to benefit the few, friends and allies are forced to turn upon one another, and all of this because the cycle of trauma and abuse runs deep, until you decide to be the one who breaks it. Resist moved me. The voice acting has this hushed sort of resignation to it that is absolutely haunting.
When were you gonna tell me?
Now? Come on, cut me a break. I'm not good at goodbyes.
But you told everyone else?
Yeah? So? You're here now, aren't you?
I am.
The character design scratches at that sort of doll-like uncanniness best represented by Shin Megami Tensei artist Kazuma Kaneko. The cinematography and color saturation of some scenes in particular, and the way that the story is always fucking with non-linearity, you can definitely see the Wong Kar-wai influences. But the fucking music, man. It has been playing all through this section, and I would say that outside of Nier composer Keiichi Okabe's music, I've never been hit this hard by a soundtrack ever. And I mean ever. Seriously, this game is goddamn beautiful, but I am certain that some people watching this video will take one look at this footage and think, Jesus, those textures and all that flickering, this game looks like shit. And sadly, that is because this footage was captured on the Switch version of 1000 Times Resist. And with this being a 4-person operation built in Unity, I'm afraid the scaling was not kind to this particular port. I'll play some footage from the PC version for comparison just to show you what the game should have looked like, and if fidelity is a concern of yours, just play it on the PC release, because the frame rate here and the resolution, it is definitely compromised on Nintendo's aging console. But honestly for me, while it bothered me right at the beginning, I found myself enraptured in the story being told so thoroughly that it just ceased to matter. And I even found myself excusing it and comparing the low resolution to that sort of low poly aesthetic that you might find in something like Killer 7. I won't fight you if you can't buy what I'm selling, but I promise you this. If you care about storytelling in video games, the compromise found here on the Switch isn't a deal breaker. It's not ideal, but I couldn't have been bothered to care with how beautiful the game was on every other artistic level. For some final thoughts on Resist, I'll say this. I may not be an Asian North American whose parents fled a divided nation forced to live in a North American diaspora, but my wife is. And I've seen this trauma and how it affects the future generation. That feeling of instability, that constant sense of scarcity, and that tenuous feeling of belonging while always having to battle those who will make you and your family feel othered. It is heavy shit just seeing it from the outside. And no amount of waving the banner of Stop Asian Hate can get close to making it feel right. And when I answer to the depression, codependency, erratic sense of self, and predisposition to substance abuse that has been handed down to me by my parents, and the abuses of people that were brought into our home unknowingly, this game resonated in such a way that gave words to some of the things that I've seen surrounding the one person on this earth that I love more than anything, while also dredging up pain from a parent that I'll never get to see again. And I hope you're resting, Mom. Seriously, I haven't covered either Drakengard 3 or Nier Automata on this channel yet. I will in due time, but I can honestly say that this is the hardest that I have been rocked by a video game since either of those titles. Long live 1000 Times Resist, long live Sunset Visitor, play this game. If 1000 Times Resist was a story about flawed systems breaking people to where they continue to break their own people further and further down the line, Omori is how feelings of loss, guilt, loss of innocence, and a desire to hold on to and protect that innocence can affect not just one individual, but all of those that they shut out by trying to wrestle with those things. Omori is the type of game that almost bait and switches the player. On one hand, it is a reimagining of childhood, not just in the way that the story is told, but also in the way that it is presented in developer Omocat's interpretation of Earthbound-inspired RPG Maker design. Omori is a JRPG that takes place in two distinct places, even though it is far more nuanced than even that. And just keep in mind, again, I'm going to keep things vague or even slightly misleading here because I don't want to spoil anything important. With the name Omori being a reference to the Japanese concept of Hikikomori, This title references the extreme social withdrawal and self-imposed isolation that our protagonist has been going through by the time that we meet him. Sunny, our real-world protagonist, is wrestling with his grief from his suburban bedroom and has completely withdrawn from the real world of faraway town after the death of his sister has left him broken and dealing with an incurable sense of depression and a survivor's guilt of sorts. Instead of going out and living in the real world, Sunny retreats into a dream universe over and over where he can exist in white space. A realm where nothing of consequence happens and nothing can hurt him. And when he's feeling up to it, he goes and visits his friends deeper in this dreamscape in a place known as Headspace. Here, Sunny is no longer Sunny. He is the hero Omori, a younger and idealized version of himself. And here he hangs out with his friends Kel, Aubrey, Hiro, Basil, and his sister Mari, who is still alive here and is always kept safe. Here in Headspace, animals can talk, monsters are real but they can always be overcome. Here, bikers who look scary only exist to offer good advice. And here in this place, Omori can overcome his fears. And it is in this place where Omori and his friends can get into fights with even the earth itself if they feel like it. It is a childish fantasy. Everyone is innocent, and even the bad guys are more silly and stupid than menacing. It is Saturday morning cartoon stuff, but this is all a defense mechanism. In an early sequence in Headspace, Omori's friend Basil shows our protagonist a photo album that shows Omori and friends as they make their way through adolescence and the dog days of summer. That is, until the real world intrudes upon Omori, and he is forced back into his reality as Sunny. A reality where he is all alone, a place where he is terrified of everything, and even navigating his house to quell the hunger pangs that woke him in the middle of the night is met with a panic attack as he makes his way down the stairs. This is a place where his mom has already moved out of the house, with him to follow and move in with her in just 3 days' time. And this is a place where he's older than he is in Headspace, well into his teenage years. And this is the place where Sunny finds himself when his very real friend Kel, not the idealized version from Headspace, is finally able to drag Sunny out of his house for the first time in years after banging on the front door for entirely too long. Omori takes place between both of these realities, but the contrast between these two worlds shows us what Sunny has spent so many years avoiding. All the kids have grown up in real life, everyone was broken by the death of Mari, everyone who Omori is friends with in Headspace, they are all real, but they aren't friends anymore in Faraway Town. Everything hurt too much when she died, everyone changed too much or stayed the same too much, and Sunny, he stayed away for far too long. You have 3 days to figure shit out. During the day, you can play with Kel, you learn about what happened in real life, you learn about Mari, you learn about what your friends are going through, you get into fights, but here, people really get hurt, even if you are a weakling. But every night, when Sunny is back to being alone, he retreats into the world he wishes he could live in permanently. A place where all the pain of real life can be avoided, and where he can distract himself with RPG battles and bullshit side quests. And if I'm being completely honest, it took me right up until the end to fully get Omori. The hyperactive and off-kilter vibe of Headspace, the strange but beautiful musical choices, and the simple but fairly interesting battle system, it was all a vibe for sure. Turn-based mechanics that offered up enough strategy to stay engaging throughout, a tag system in battles that allowed for fun follow-ups, and an emotion-based status system that offered a rock-paper-scissors approach to combat based around strategic buffs and debuffs in order to turn the tides. This system, when coupled with the beautiful pixel art and color palette of Headspace, an exploration tag system that allows the player to change the party leader in order to use each of the members' unique abilities, such as Hiro's ability to charm, Aubrey's ability to smash through obstacles, and Omori's ability to slash through spiderwebs and traffic cones. This is a fun little RPG for sure. But Omori lays on so many side quests that feel meaningless, so many interactions that feel undercooked, plotlines that feel silly for the sake of silliness, that all of this, once things got moving in the real world of Faraway Town and Sunny's story came into sharper focus, I found myself increasingly irritated with having to be dragged back to Headspace. This place was bullshit. An RPG side story that didn't seem to have any real stakes or relevance to the real world troubles that were waiting for Sunny when he woke up. Just an endless amount of side quests that offered just the most incremental upgrades to a combat system that, while fun in its own right, only seemed to offer a distraction from what Sunny was going through in the real world. Just an endless adventure that would take up time and stop Sunny from dealing with his own problem. Oh, I get it now. I won't spoil it, but what is waiting for Sunny out there when you peel back the mystery, it's hard to come back from. This game definitely handles concepts such as loss, grief, suicidality, pressures to grow up, the desire to waste away, and guilt, and most importantly, moving on, no matter how painful and terrifying, better than any game that I've ever played before. There is life after survival, but you do have to open yourself up to it, and once you've done that, all you can do is hope that those you love will be willing to follow. Omori is one of those rare games where even its weaknesses become its strengths, where pretty much nothing is superfluous even though it gives the illusion of most things being just that. And by the time the credits were gearing up to roll, I admit with no shame that this game had me bawling heavily in a way that I didn't think video games could do anymore. If you like turn-based RPGs, this is seriously world class. If you like story-based games, you need to play this. But more than either of the two games that I've covered before this one, if you are going through your own battles, put this title in your back pocket. Omori is heavy, but I do recommend it for when you are ready. And it is also one of those rare games that I would recommend for people who struggle to understand depression when it is coming from their loved ones, as this game paints a pretty good picture of some of the shit that we all have to deal with sometimes. Omori is profound. There are moments in this game that hit the lowest of lows as far as depressing games go, but between the whimsy of Headspace and the feeling of hope present in key moments of the title, I would say that this one ends up being one of the more cathartic examples of bittersweetness that I've ever seen done in a video game. And it's amazing. Just pick it up when you get a chance, but from here on out, it's all bad. The next two entries on this list are kind of a package deal. Milk Inside a Bag of Milk and Milk Outside a Bag of Milk are both short visual novels created by Russian game developer and musician Nikita Krukov. They both follow the story of an unnamed young woman that is currently dealing with extreme mental illness that seems to have been dialed up to 1,000 after some extreme physical and emotional trauma. The first game's plot is fairly simple. The girl needs to leave her flat and head down to a convenience store in order to buy a bag of milk. But in execution, this is anything but simple. The very act of walking, the anticipation of having to communicate with others, or even handle money, all of these things trigger an extreme amount of anxiety, and the real world melts away as our main character's unnamed trauma morphs the world around her into something alien. The whole game is presented in this low-resolution monochromatic art style, with a previous physical trauma being responsible for our main character only being able to perceive the world in shades of red. People take on forms that are anything but human, the environments are twisted and hardly identifiable, almost as if they had been photographed on a Game Boy camera and then filtered for maximum disassociation, and the music is made up of dissonant droning synths that always make the player feel ill at ease and like the soundscape and the rest of the game can collapse at any moment. And in practice, it can. The player's role in Milk Inside is kind of hard to define, and purposely so. Our protagonist is trying to gather up the strength to complete her trip, and the player, whether they represent the rational side of the young woman's mind, a schizophrenic voice that only she can hear, or the effects of the medication that she has been taking, you as the player, for the majority of this 20 to 30 minute experience, have to continuously push this girl onward. And the degree of how supportive versus how dickish you want to be about it is really the singular choice that you have as the player. But if you push too hard, the game collapses, and this happens as our protagonist becomes entirely overwhelmed and retreats into a panic attack. Successfully gathering the milk is the halfway part of the journey, with the walk back taking up the rest of the game, and it is here where the young woman relates to the player directly. In this case, the player of a visual novel that the young lady is suddenly aware that she is being piloted through. And whether this is a fourth wall break or simply a coping device for our main character, that line is blurred. But it is here where we get some vague insight into what must have happened to our protagonist to make her function this way. And man, it is bleak. This whole experience is about practicing a real sort of empathy, as everything here is so detached from reality, and you have to follow this character through an alien type of logic that feels hardly coherent at times, and help her move forward without triggering the worst parts of her condition. And while this game is expertly written, this tone, when coupled with the fact that it is a foreign language work that has been translated into English, it is hard to know exactly where some of this disconnect is actually coming from. Is this just an incoherent character, or has something been lost in translation? And for me personally, it never truly mattered, because whatever was happening, it only upped the fish out of water feeling of this game in such a way that no work of art has ever done for me before. It is incredible stuff, but don't expect to feel great after completing it. When I was 26 years old, almost 11 years ago, I made some concrete plans to leave this world. Things had gotten to that point. Everything seemed hopeless, the pain and alienation from day-to-day life had gotten out of control, and I found myself in a severely altered state of mind that was further altered by mixing pills and alcohol, and I had wandered into an empty flood control channel near my home with the intent of my body never leaving that place. Obviously, I failed. A failure that is now seen as a blessing, but then in that exact moment, a failure that kind of broke my brain and started up the much needed process of ego death. I was too much of a failure to even do that right. And of course, I was hospitalized shortly after. And during a mandatory hold, I was settled in with people that had problems far greater than even my own. People who were years and even decades deep into meth addiction, people with self-inflicted scars on their arm that were raised nearly a full inch above the surface, and in one particular case, a young kid that had already gone through multiple schizophrenic breaks. This dude couldn't have been older than 19, and already he was battling with something invisible to everyone else around him. He moved erratically, he would scream one moment, whisper the next, pace around for a second, and then get lost in some pretty dope dance moves to a soundtrack that seemingly only he could hear. Suffice it to say, people were wary of him, even in a place where everyone was fucked up. Myself included, if I'm being honest. I mean, the dude was volatile. But as luck would have it, one day after going a little stir crazy, I found myself pacing the halls with him, doing opposing laps through the corridor. And just as we were getting ready to pass one another for the 10th time or so, he whipped around and locked eyes with me. And I'll never forget that look, man. Full-on disassociation. But there was nothing dangerous about it. It was childlike. We were friends on the playground in that moment. And he asked me in a sincere tone, "Are you aware that the Archangel Michael has been following you since you got here?" And I told him I didn't know this. But then I told him, that sounds like a pretty good thing to have following you. He told me it was the best thing. And then he did his spinning dance move as he left the corridor. From that point on, for the rest of my stay in the hospital, he would sit next to me during group activities and mealtime. And as we became more familiar with each other, I could kind of see when the stimuli of the hospital was mellow enough for us to speak normally, and when he was completely, for lack of better words, lost in the sauce. We became friendly during my short stay. But every time we spoke, I was always hyper aware of his rhythms. I always paid attention to what was said, what wasn't being said, and I was always watching his eyes and checking in with him to make sure that he was okay. This game, Milk Inside a Bag of Milk, made me feel like I was talking to that guy again. And while I have decided to leave his name out of this video for respect of his privacy, I really hope he's doing alright. He stayed behind after I left the hospital, and I really hope that he is living the best life possible in the years since I've last seen him. Milk Inside really challenges the player with a situation like the one that I just outlined, and I never would have thought that a video game would be capable of recreating a feeling like that. It's strange stuff. It's dope stuff. I purchased both Milk Inside and Milk Outside a Bag of Milk as a bundle for about $2 on the Switch during a recent sale, with the everyday price going for about $8 for the pair of games. And even at that price, I do consider the two games to be a steal. Both games are available on Steam and itch.io for similar prices, but the Switch version presents both the original and the 2021 sequel as a duology with a convenient front end. And I think that this might be the most ideal way to play both of these titles, as the second game takes place moments after the first one ends. And keep in mind for this section, I'm going to spoil some bits from the first game because otherwise I'd be talking around the plot in a way that feels a little nonsensical. If the first game was interesting enough for you to care about this second one, just play the damn games, and then feel free to come back to this section of the video. Otherwise, stop the video, play both. It'll take you about 2 hours to see everything, and then come back. But don't forget to drop a like or maybe a sub if you've made it this far. Or just feel free to click onto the next section of this video found in the description. With her chore handled, the protagonist makes her way back to her apartment. But right away, the art style and production levels show that this is going to be a much more ambitious experience this time around. After a short anime cutscene more or less recaps the events of the first game, we are thrown back into the red and black aesthetic. But this time around, things look far more sinister and even downright evil. And the soundtrack has evolved to include sludgy guitar riffs that place this soundscape firmly into the territory of drone metal. It's unsettling, it's effective, and it's fucking rad. But where Milk Inside was largely a fish out of water story, Milk Outside is actually a story about how our main character functions within the relative safety of her own home. But if you were expecting a happier narrative and a more calming experience, you would be sorely mistaken. We see how this young lady interprets her space and even her own mother, how she interprets the drugs that she has to take, and how everything around her in her room plays into constantly reminding her of the traumas that she has been slowly recovering from. Maybe recovering is the wrong word, maybe continues to deal with is the better way of saying it, but after experiencing the opening events of this sequel from the same perspective that we played the first game through, our main character recognizes how viewing her life as a visual novel helped her overcome the ordeal of running an errand. So here back in her room, after her scattered thoughts get the best of her and start to manifest as fireflies erupting from her psyche, fireflies that take flight and hide amongst the objects in her space, here in her room, instead she believes that viewing her life as a point-and-click adventure game can be a helpful coping mechanism. And you, the player, you play as the same voice that helped her before, as well as the impartial player actually navigating this adventure. It is meta stuff, but it continues to play into the detachment that we saw in the first title. Here we interact with objects, our main character gives us some backstory on what they mean, and then we have the option to push and prod, or we can encourage and protect. But as you interact with these objects, it is very clear that there are limits on how much this young lady actually wants to discuss these things. And only if you are able to properly motivate her will you learn the specifics of everything. Where the first game only had one real ending, 2 if you count the protagonist being pushed to her breaking point, Milk Outside has 5. And which one you get is dependent on how you navigate your dialogue options and how many fireflies you help the protagonist find. And most of these are brutal in their own right. Learning about her past, we discovered that this young lady has been troubled, long before she was dragged out of school, and long before her father ended his life by jumping out of their apartment window. And we learned that even when things were relatively okay for our protagonist, she was always a bit maladjusted. And even when she was younger, she was put through the ringer. I don't want to spoil too much, but there is a sequence in which a discussion about our protagonist on the internet explains that she used to think that the internet was fake. A computer program where she spoke to NPCs pretending to be real people, and they would only discuss things that the user liked to talk about. But one day, one of the NPCs broke the fourth wall. This was a real person, and they were able to get sensitive information out of our main character. And the resulting ridicule and embarrassment was enough for her to close herself off from the community that she had built ever since. Where the first game was an extremely linear experience, the very structure of Milk Outside forces the player to play this game non-linearly, and it is up to the player more than ever to piece things together. With Milk Outside ultimately ending once our protagonist has satisfied her need to gather her thoughts, she gets ready for bed, wondering if the player, or the voice, will be there tomorrow to help her through yet another difficult day. And really, I think it is here in this ending where the game managed to be incredibly profound. Here, the ending is just the promise that our character will live for another day, just to do all of this over and over again. And really, anyone with significant mental illness will tell you that this is quite possibly the most realistic depiction of mental illness. I am over 10 years removed from my worst days. I pursue plenty of things that keep me happy, motivated, and fulfilled. I work a good job, I have a beautiful wife, and my friends are the shit. But some days just come in and kick my ass, and I find myself thinking thoughts that, while not as extreme as they once were, they are definitely circling the same drain. And I see it with everyone that struggles with this shit. Around a year and a half ago, one of my closest friends, Michael, was neck deep in the throes of depression and alcoholism. And when I tell you it was heavy, heavy is an understatement. In just a few months, he stopped going to work, damn near lost his career that he had been working so hard to obtain, the relationship he was in ended, and he had to leave the apartment that he was living in. I helped when I could, leaving work early to check in on him more than a few times. We leaned into his friend group and everyone that could help. but nothing was really taking. And on the last day that I saw him before he finally agreed to be hospitalized and work on his sobriety, a day that was coincidentally his birthday, I was acutely aware with me standing in his then emptied apartment that the dude was at rock bottom. And in that moment, for whatever reason, and I can't tell you exactly why, I decided to snap this picture of what I was seeing. A hell of a dude, the most ambitious dude I've ever fucking met, reduced to a puddle in the middle of a sea of empty 99 bananas bottles, pills, and cigarettes. Luckily now, a year and a half later, Michael is killing it. He's sober, he's crushing it at work, he's in a great relationship, and he's absolutely killing it with his hip-hop project, Multifaceted Monster. And you can find the link in the bio for that.
Spectator, expect hate. They mad like they got they check laid. I'm moving fast since life don't last, so I ain't got time for no dead weight. When you elevate, it's hella hate. Apparently you're not supposed to do that. I've been thinking to myself, like, how these fools so stupid? It's too bad.
And I just cannot be prouder of my friend. Seriously, check out his music on Spotify or any other streaming service while you're at it. It's dope. He's dope. But both of us know that this battle, it's never really over. Every single time one of us hits a wall or gets stressed out or even gets pushed to our breaking points, we have to constantly recalibrate and consciously decide not to go down the rabbit hole once again. And this game, Milk Outside, I cannot stress how much I was able to relate to this and how important I find it to put some of these scenarios in games. Most people in day-to-day life try their best to pretend that these types of problems don't exist. And for one dude to get up and decide to make not just one but two games like this, putting it all out there, bravo, Nikita Krukov. I can't wait to see what you do next. But with most of the games in this video ending with a sense of hope, or at the very least, the choice to fight again, what happens when creators decide to write stories about the end of the battle? Stories about losing the fight. Actual Sunlight was actually the game that kicked off this video. I caught myself in that familiar depression and remembered that shortly after my attempt 10 years ago, I remembered that alongside the therapy, the coping mechanisms, and the strengthening of my support system, there were actually a few works, and in this case, video games, that helped me push through the battle to get better. One of them was Drakengard 3, which has since become my favorite game of all time, and I will definitely cover it on this channel once I figure out how to properly write that essay. But the other was Actual Sunlight. Written and developed by Will O'Neill, Actual Sunlight is a story that chronicles the last remaining days of Evan Winter. The game is largely autobiographical, as O'Neill dealt with the struggles and depression that led to him writing this story. And it covers the rapid descent from someone who is clinically depressed and very much on their way to ending it all. This is another one of those RPG Maker joints, with the console versions of the game running on Unity. But as far as gameplay goes, this is another simple title. You walk around, you interact with people and objects, and then Evan Winter's thoughts, and more importantly, O'Neill's immaculate prose cuts through the bullshit, with everything being put on the line. Keep in mind that this is a game that starts with the aptly named short story, Why Kill Yourself Today When You Can Masturbate Tomorrow? From the opening lines onward, we are catapulted through the life of Evan, and every man staring down the barrel of 30. He is working a dead-end job, he is severely depressed, he self-medicates with junk food, video games, and alcohol, which in turn has made himself hate the body that he feels stuck in, and he laments the future that he feels that he has robbed himself of. For Evan, hope is all but gone, and by the end of this story, there is nothing left. It is a train wreck in slow motion, and you as the player are powerless to offer any life preserver. We watch as he alienates himself, berates himself for every little mistake that he makes, and retreats further and further into escapism, but even there, he is never truly free of the self-loathing. Every single day that you play through starts the same. You get ready for work, you do the triple S, and then you board the elevator. But whenever you get into the elevator, you are always met with the following message. And as the game progresses, this thought becomes more and more intrusive, until it becomes this, and finally, this. And back when I played this game for the very first time, it was this moment and one other that really stuck with me. Back when my brain was fighting against me on a moment-to-moment basis, I distinctly remember driving to work, everything would be fine, I would be sucking down Camel filters and blasting death metal in order to get myself ready to take on the day, numb to most of what was going on. But suddenly an intrusive thought would emerge from the depths of my limbic system, and it was always the same thing, just an image. A single image stylized similarly to a comic book splash page in red and black ink. And that image was always just of me slamming on the gas in my '93 Ford Escort and driving it headfirst into a K-rail. I'd shake it off. Sometimes it wouldn't be there, but that image presented itself to me plenty of times before I ultimately tried to leave. And right here, I want to state, I don't have thoughts like that anymore. I'm okay. I've just been dealing with the low stakes effects of depression recently. But because of my past, I'm always hyper aware of the threat level that I'm up against. I have my friends, I have my wife, I have myself, and I'm never going back to where I was. And writing, even videos like this, has always been one of my best coping mechanisms. But if you are watching this video and you feel like you don't have all the tools to deal with your own problems, or you are struggling with something similar to what is being discussed here, feel free to email me or reach out in any way, and I promise that I will get you in contact with some resources that can help. More people are dealing with this kind of stuff than you know, and I'm always down to lend a hand. The second moment outside of the elevator scene that fucked me up from this game is something a little bit more esoteric. There are multiple entries in which Evan imagines himself on a late night talk show or talking to a therapist. And these sections basically play out with Evan monologuing, talking to these people about imaginary accomplishments that he's made, or his thoughts being examined as if he is some sort of novel case and a man who has figured everything out. But it all comes crashing down when Evan admits to himself that this is all bullshit. He never did anything worthy of being on a late night talk show, and while he did try to go to therapy one time, he split and never came back. So all these conversations with the therapist, they're all just in his head. All of this was escapist fantasy in which Evan could make himself feel more important and to justify his slipping mental state. And for me, playing this game fresh off of my own breakdown, this was entirely too real. When I was 26, I was working a job that barely paid the bills and had no future. And I had dreams about one day becoming a novelist. I wrote a little, a few short stories here and there, and I had a little more than half of a novel written, but in reality, I talked to other people about the novel that I was writing and spent far more time thinking about the novel that I was working on than I ever did actually writing it. But back then, this concept I had of myself, of being an artist, it was the only thing that made me feel like I wasn't so pathetic. I was working on something bigger than myself. And even if I was a starving artist with nothing to show for it, god damn it, I was an artist. And pretty much the same way that it is presented here, more times than I'd care to admit, I would lie in bed for hours before I could finally crash out, or I would retreat into my own mind while I was driving, and I would imagine myself being interviewed on NPR. I'd play out fantasies where I was receiving an award for something that I had written. I'd imagine that I had actually written something that was worth a shit, and that tons of people were now congratulating me on doing the one thing that I was always too tired and too burnt out to actually complete. It's embarrassing, and I'll be honest with you right now. I never finished that novel. It still exists half completed on my computer, but I no longer have those self-aggrandizing thoughts. I will either finish it one day, or I won't. But I do right now. I write short stories from time to time, and I pour as much of myself as I can into these videos. But back when the fantasy of being a novelist was seemingly my only way out of what I was up against, I was always too afraid to ever find out if I was actually good enough to do it. But now, I'm in a place where I'm never wondering where my next meal is going to come from, and I'm doing infinitely better than I was back then. And while my writing nowadays may be overly verbose and navel-gazy bullshit, I am locking in and completing these videos. Actual sunlight played a part in this. O'Neill's writing is hyper-effective stuff. You know he's lived it all. You can feel it. And even though this story is ultimately a tragedy, O'Neill has escaped it. He's written multiple games at this point, Actual Sunlight, Guildmaster Story, Superliminal, and many more. And he has escaped this trap. He got to the other side of this battle, and now he is making rad shit. Sure, his stuff deserves more eyeballs than it tends to get, but motherfucker did it. And after the credits rolled, I knew that I can get through it too. This game made me know that I wasn't as alone as I had assumed. On the opposite side of the spectrum, Iron Lung is about being utterly alone in a truly inescapable situation, and there is no room for hope. In this 2022 release by David Szymanski, creator of Dusk, Fingerbones, the recent Butcher's Creek, and many more. Oh, and by the way, I was turned onto Iron Lung by friend of the channel Hypertension Films after watching one of his videos, and he coincidentally has already covered Butcher's Creek and a few other Szymanski games. So check him out if you haven't already after watching this section. In Iron Lung, the universe is dying. An event known as the Quiet Rapture removed all planets and stars from the known universe, leaving only uninhabitable moons and the few starships in space left, with the only light source being the light from dead stars. You play as a convict who has been forced to land on one of these moons after detecting a strange anomaly, an ocean of blood, and it is your mission to pilot a one-man submarine to the ocean floor and look for potential resources. There was no time for training, the craft was not built for the depths that you will be exploring, and to compensate for that, you have been welded into the craft and the forward window has been closed. And if you somehow survive this doomed mission, you will be granted your freedom. So that's the setup. You crawl around the ocean floor in the dark as you navigate through and around tunnels and rocks with nothing but a poorly rendered map as your guide. You make your way towards marked coordinates, and once you fix your heading, you make your way to the back of the craft in order to snap a picture of your target. But all of this is so much easier said than done. The feedback in this game is close to non-existent without the ability to see. You can move your craft forward and backward and you can spin your heading, but the only real feedback that you get is either a radar beeping when you're closing in on a wall, and if you crash into it, you're dead, or if you are extremely lost, you can always use your camera to try and get your bearings. But once you wrap your head around this type of gameplay, it is surprisingly intuitive and maybe even kind of fun. But with a conceit as bleak as this, you have to expect that things can only get worse. Pressure valves blow out, water starts to leak in, and even fires can ignite within your craft. But nothing is worse than the moment that you find out that you are not alone down here. I won't spoil it, just in case you haven't played this game, but the ending is simultaneously one of the most horrifying and unintentionally funny bits of gallows humor that I've ever experienced. All that being said, the moment-to-moment gameplay here has a way of locking you in unlike anything else I've ever played. As you contend with everything stacked against you, and that sense of dread that creeps in as you blindly skate against the walls while your radar only gets louder and louder, and then those moments where the absolutely amazing soundtrack creeps in, I mean, fuck man. This game makes you feel alone and helpless in a way that is almost impossible not to be hyperbolic about. And as your situation becomes more and more clear, I couldn't help but feel that overwhelming sense of dread as I was pushing forward. You know you're fucked. You know you are going to drown. You know there's no way out. In a medium where most games are about making the player feel empowered, it is extremely rare to play something that makes you feel this weak and exposed. This title may not fit in with the rest of the video in terms of depression and trauma on the surface, but in terms of how it makes you feel, it's right there. That sense of despair, there are no other games like it. And finally, to round out this video, no game has ever nailed despair better than this final entry. This is another Will O'Neill joint, so you know this one is heavy. Released in 2017, Little Red Lie is something of a follow-up to Actual Sunlight. But where Actual Sunlight had a narrative of one individual being destroyed by himself as he locked into the worst parts of society, Little Red Lie is about complete societal collapse and how it chews up those stupid enough to get in the way. It plays almost identically to Actual Sunlight. Walk around, interact, get obliterated by O'Neill's prose. But this time around, the hook is that every single interaction available to you is a lie of some form. Whether it be lying to yourself to justify your actions or lying to your family to spare them the worry, all you can do here is lie. And even though this game definitely examines all of the reasons why people lie, both noble and devious, this game is so much bigger than that. You play as two principal characters, Sarah Stone and Arthur Fox. Sarah is recently unemployed by the time that the story starts, but she can't quite tell her parents yet. Mom is sick, dad is retired and trying to take care of his wife as best as he can, and Sarah's sister spends all of her time locked in the basement below the house after struggling with a deep depression that has repeatedly gotten as bad as it gets. Arthur Fox, on the other hand, is a sort of self-help guru who is richer than God. And when he isn't ripping off his fan base, who he has infinite disdain for, he spends the rest of his time and money on sex workers and coke. The story follows both characters as they deal with the consequences, or lack thereof, of both their actions and inactions. In Sarah's case, the gig economy has completely crushed all of her plans to get ahead. The housing market has gotten to the point where if you aren't inheriting a house, you'll never have one. And if your parents weren't rich, any chances of class mobility are completely shut off to you. And this is all while Sarah's sister is bleeding her family dry through the convenience of an unnamed Amazon Prime analog. Long story short, Little Red Lie is about how this late-stage capitalism destroys Sarah and her family one by one, and how Arthur, despite being one of the most lecherous human beings to walk the earth, is consistently able to slink away from his increasingly horrific actions, simply because of the fact that he has accumulated enough wealth to afford to make these mistakes, and because he generates too much income for those above him to be cast to the wolves. I don't want to spoil the specifics because I recommend this game with zero reservations, but this is an evolution of O'Neill's craft. Everything looks better, the scope is bigger, and even though it is simple, stylistic choices bumped this game well above the more generic RPG Maker look of actual Sunlight. But I will say this game fucked me up for days after finishing it. Watching the system completely destroy Sarah and her family, and watching the smallest mistakes tip the story over into extreme tragedy, all while Arthur was able to do monstrous things, we've all felt this before. And at this particular time, it feels more like a prophecy of things to come than just speculative dystopian fiction. Little Red Lie is too real, too well written, too profound to be overlooked. But don't be surprised if it radicalizes you after playing it, if you aren't there already. Just from the moment that this game starts, you know you are in for a bummer time, and it never lets off the gas. Let's just hope that we can all work together before this game and its story becomes a reality for us all. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you for watching. And if you liked the video, please consider dropping a like, comment, or subscribing to the channel. Every bit helps the channel more than you'd know. I think games like the ones that we covered here are important. In an era of live service distractions and more games than we can ever play being made available, it might seem like an insane thing to do, spending your free time on something that is designed to bum you out, but I truly think that if we acknowledge shared suffering and work together, we can definitely help each other through it. I promise the next video won't be like this, but I can't promise that there won't be more like it in the future. I hope to see you in the next video, and until then, you're all beautiful people, and I hope you have a great day.